So we're thinking about how the earliest people who saw these texts. So that means we're not talking about Paul. Paul never saw even a rough draft of Mark's Gospel. Okay, so whatever information Paul had about Jesus, he didn't get it by reading the Gospels. So what was he getting? What was he telling his people about Jesus? And we don't have much to go with when we try to answer that question. But maybe around the time that Paul is dying, so somewhere in the 60s, we can perhaps think that some of the earliest literary and oral sources that are going to turn up in the Gospels are beginning to circulate. People are telling stories of what Jesus said, and eventually we get Mark's Gospel. So although we say Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, it's really Mark first. And one of the ways of trying to get a sense of how people might have been using it, is to notice what happens when Matthew comes along and his community is using Mark, and he goes, we could do a better version of that. And so he kind of rehashes Mark, so Matthew's Gospel is a kind of new and enlarged edition of the Gospel according to Mark, but we call it the Gospel of Matthew. So we can see Matthew is partly correcting or clarifying some of Mark's maybe not carefully thought out language, being more attentive to doctrinal issues. Interestingly, Matthew, for instance, has collected a whole lot of Jesus material to create what we call the Sermon on the Mount. But when we get to the Lord's Prayer, we have a different version of the Lord's Prayer in Matthew than we get in Luke. And that's possibly because Matthew's going to use the version of the Lord's Prayer that his people already know. So when he gets to that bit where the version might have been similar to Luke, he's saying, no, we're going to use the version of the Lord's Prayer that the churches in Syria, inverted commas, which is really southern Turkey coming down through Lebanon, he's modifying the tradition he's picking up from Mark and from Q, and he's adapting it to be more relevant to his context. So he wants it to sound familiar and not be totally strange, but he's also telling more of the story. So expanding the story, clarifying the language, often making the story a bit sharper and shorter than Mark has done. So there's a bit of editorial copy editing going on. And with things like the Sermon on the Mount, particularly the Lord's Prayer, I think trying to package the teachings of Jesus in a way that the people will recognize as, yep, we know this stuff. This is what we're already saying this in church. So it's becoming more familiar to them, I think. So that's part of I think part of the process by which the early Christians are using the New Testament. Exactly how they're doing it, we don't know. I mean, Paul never, because the Gospels weren't written, Paul never refers to how the Gospels might be used within the gathered community on a Sunday morning or a Saturday night. And yet it becomes clear that is where they're being used. And that they're because they're a whole series of mostly short stories, they're quite suitable as we still use them in episodes week after week. But our evidence for the earliest lectionaries are much later. We don't get lectionaries at the earliest stage of the process.